Snow had a way of erasing the world until only the things that struggled remained. It flattened sound, swallowed color, and pressed itself against the land like a hand determined to smother anything still warm. The cabin stood in the middle of that silence, small and wounded, its roof sagging under a burden it was never built to carry. Wind slid through the broken seams of its walls and escaped through the fractured corners of its roof, carrying with it the last fragile heat of those inside. Each gust made the structure groan, not loudly, but with the exhausted complaint of something that had endured too much for too long. She stood outside it with both hands gripping a warped plank that no longer obeyed the nails meant to hold it. Her fingers were red and cracked, the skin split in thin lines that had bled and frozen more times than she could count. Snow gathered in her dark hair and clung there, unmelted, because her body no longer wasted warmth on such luxuries. She leaned her weight into the board, pressing it back into place against the frame, knowing even as she tried that the effort was temporary. The wind pushed from the other side with the stubborn patience of winter itself. Behind her, inside the dim cabin, her daughters sat on the floor wrapped in blankets too thin to stop the cold. They watched her through the open gap in the wall, their small faces pale, their eyes wide with the quiet awareness children carried when they understood more than they could explain. They did not cry. They had learned not to cry when cold was the enemy, because tears only froze faster than breath. She pushed harder against the plank, her boots slipping in the deep snow beneath her. The board shifted for a moment, almost willing to pretend it might hold, before the next gust it loose again. The sound it made was small, but to her it carried the weight of finality. She closed her eyes briefly, not in surrender, but in a kind of exhausted prayer she no longer believed anyone heard. One more storm would break it. She knew that with the certainty of someone who had lived too long beside failure. One more night of wind like this, and the roof would give way, and the cold would pour in without resistance. She had measured the strength of every beam with her hands, traced every crack with her fingers, and she understood the truth of the cabin better than she understood her own heart. Her husband had built it with hope, not skill. He had believed hope was enough. He had been wrong. The memory of him came without invitation, as it always did when the cold grew sharpest. His hands had been larger than hers, stronger, but even they had not been strong enough to fight the fever that took him. It had come in the night, quiet and patient, and by morning he had already begun slipping somewhere she could not follow. She had held his hand as the heat left him, feeling the exact moment when the man she loved became only a body. She had buried him herself because there had been no one else. Since then, winter had not been a season, it had been an opponent. Inside, one of the girls shifted closer to the broken wall. Their eyes met. The child did not speak, but she did not need to. The question was always the same. Are we safe? She forced a smile that felt like something carved into her face rather than born from it. The girl accepted it because children believed what they needed to believe. A sound reached her then, faint beneath the wind. At first she thought it was only the storm changing its voice, but it came again, rhythmic and deliberate. She turned her head slowly, her breath caught halfway between hope and caution. A rider emerged through the white distance. He appeared gradually, first as movement, then as shape, then as a man on horseback pushing through snow that reached the animal's chest. He rode with the steady endurance of someone who understood winter as something to be endured, not fought. Snow clung to his coat and hat, and his shoulders were hunched slightly against the wind, but he did not hesitate. She stood motionless, her hand still holding the useless plank, as he approached. He slowed when he saw her, his eyes moving from her to the cabin and back again. There was no alarm in his expression, only a quiet recognition of hardship. He guided the horse closer and stopped a few paces away. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Up close, she could see the marks of cold on his face, the roughness of a life lived outside comfort. He looked older than 30 in some ways, younger in others, as if hardship had shaped him unevenly. His gaze moved to the broken wall, to the sagging roof, to the small faces watching from inside. He understood immediately. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes lingered not on the damage, but on her daughters. He did not ask why she was here. He did not ask where her husband was. He simply saw the truth. She lowered her hand from the plank, because pretending to hold it no longer served any purpose. Our cabin is broken, she said. Her voice carried no request, it held only fact. The words hung between them, fragile and exposed. He did not answer right away. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking deep into the snow. He stood beside his horse for a moment, looking at the cabin as if measuring something only he could see. The wind pushed against them both, indifferent to their silence. He removed his gloves, revealing hands already reddened by cold and work. He stepped past her without ceremony and pressed his palm against the cabin wall. The wood shifted beneath the pressure. He walked the perimeter, examining each weakness, each failure. She watched him with guarded stillness, unsure what she expected. He stopped near the doorway and looked up at the roof. Snow had gathered there in a heavy, dangerous mass. Without speaking, he reached into the saddlebag and a hammer. The sight of it felt larger than the object itself. He returned to the broken plank and held it in place, testing its fit. Then he drove a nail through it with a single, decisive strike. The sound rang out against the silence like something alive. Her daughters flinched inside, then leaned closer, drawn by the unfamiliar promise of repair. He struck again and again. Each blow carried intention, each movement the inevitability of collapse. Snow gathered on his shoulders, on his hair, on the back of his neck, but he did not pause. She stood where she was, unable to move, watching a stranger refuse the ending she had already accepted. He worked methodically, reinforcing beams, securing joints, replacing nails that had long ago surrendered their hold. The wind resisted him, tugging at the boards, but he answered with persistence. Time stretched without measure. Her fingers grew numb at her sides, but she did not notice. Inside, the girls crept closer to the doorway. One of them stepped outside, her small boots disappearing into the snow. She approached him cautiously, holding something in her mittened hand. A nail. She offered it without speaking. He looked at her surprised, then accepted it with a nod. She smiled, small and fierce. He drove it into the wood. The other girl followed, carrying another nail. Soon they stood beside him, silent assistants in a battle they did not fully understand. The widow watched as her daughters, who had known only absence, began to orbit this man as if drawn by gravity. Something inside her shifted, fragile and dangerous. He worked until the light began to fade, until the sky deepened into the blue of approaching night. At last he stepped back. The cabin still bore its scars, but it stood now stronger. It would survive the storm. He wiped his hands on his coat and retrieved his gloves. For a moment he simply stood there, looking at the structure as if confirming its continued existence. Then he turned toward his horse. One of the girls moved quickly, grabbing his sleeve. He stopped. She looked up at him, her face open in a way only children could manage. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. The question hung in the cold air, fragile as breath. He hesitated, and in that hesitation lived every reason he should refuse. He owed them nothing. He had already given more than most would. He could leave now and carry no guilt, because survival on this land was never promised. But he looked at her small hand clutching his sleeve, at the other girl standing behind her, at the woman watching with guarded, silent hope she tried to hide. He saw the repaired wall. He saw the roof still burdened by snow. He saw what would happen if he did not return. Winter was patient. It would simply wait for the hammer to disappear. He looked down at the child, his expression unreadable beneath the gathering frost. "Yes," he said quietly. Her grip tightened, as if she needed to make certain the word was real. Behind her, the widow felt something unfamiliar and terrifying begin to thaw, and she did not yet know whether it was hope or the beginning of another loss. He returned the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, until his presence began to feel less like an interruption, and more like something the land itself had decided to allow. Snow still covered everything, but now there were always two sets of tracks leading to the cabin, hers, uncertain and careful, and his, steady and deliberate. The daughters learned to recognize the sound of his horse before they could see him, and each time it came, they ran to the doorway with the urgency of creatures who had discovered warmth and feared it might disappear if they did not greet it quickly enough. He never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes he brought cut firewood balanced across the saddle, sometimes tools, sometimes small things that did not seem important until they were. A length of stronger rope, a metal hinge to replace one that had cracked. Once, a bundle of cloth thick enough to patch the place where wind still whispered through the wall. He offered these items without ceremony, setting them down as if they had always belonged there. She thanked him each time, and each time the words felt insufficient. He spoke little while he worked. His hammer became a familiar sound, striking with calm certainty, reshaping the fragile boundaries between survival and exposure. He repaired what winter had weakened and reinforced what hope had never properly secured. He moved with the quiet focus of a man who understood that endurance was built in small, uncelebrated decisions. The daughters followed him constantly, their small boots leaving overlapping tracks around his larger ones. They watched every movement with solemn fascination, as if memorizing the exact way safety was made. Sometimes they carried nails in their tiny hands. Sometimes they only stood close enough that their presence brushed against him like fragile shadows. He did not seem to mind. She watched from the doorway often, arms folded against the cold, unsure where to place herself in this new arrangement. Gratitude filled her, but it existed beside something sharper, something more dangerous. Dependence was a luxury she had taught herself to abandon. Dependence had buried her once already. He finished repairing the worst damage within days, but he did not stop coming. One morning he arrived and began stacking firewood without explanation. Another day he reinforced the door frame. Another, he climbed onto the roof and cleared the heavy snow that threatened to crush it. She understood then that his visits were no longer about repairs. They were about thems. This realization frightened her more than the broken cabin ever had. The daughters did not share her fear. They began waiting for him in ways that revealed their certainty he would come. They pressed their faces to the window each morning, their breath fogging the glass. When his horse appeared, they ran outside before he even dismounted. They spoke to him easily, without hesitation. They asked questions about everything. Why did wood crack in cold? Why did snow shine at night? Why did horses breathe smoke? He answered when he could, and when he could not, he admitted it simply. He never pretended knowledge he did not possess, and this honesty earned their trust faster than any gift could have. She noticed the way he softened around them, the way his voice lowered, the way his movements became careful. He carried himself like a man accustomed to solitude, yet he did not resist their closeness. One afternoon, while he repaired a loose board near the doorway, one daughter held out a broken wooden spoon. "Can you fix it?" she asked. He took it, examining the split. "I can try." She watched him work, her expression intent. When he handed it back whole again, she smiled with quiet triumph. "Thank you," she said. Then, without thinking, she added, "Dad." The word fell into the air between them. Silence followed immediately. The child did not seem to realize what she had done. The other girl froze, sensing something had shifted. The widow stepped forward quickly, her voice tight. "She didn't mind." "It's all right," he said. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at the child. Something unreadable moved behind his eyes. The girl accepted his answer without question, because children believed what was given to them. But the widow felt the word echo inside her with terrifying force. "Dad." It was not a title earned lightly. It was not something that could be repaired like wood or metal. It was something that could be lost. That night after he left, the daughters spoke of him in quiet voices as they lay beneath their blankets. They wondered if he would return tomorrow. They wondered if he liked them. They wondered if he would stay forever. She listened from her chair beside the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She did not know the answers. Days passed and winter loosened its grip only slightly. The cold remained, but it no longer felt absolute. His presence had altered the shape of their survival. He began staying longer during his visits. Sometimes he sat near the fire after finishing his work, his large frame awkward inside the small space. They spoke then, cautiously at first, about practical things. Weather, livestock, distance. But slowly the conversations grew. He told her about the land beyond the hills, about the way snow melted first along the southern slopes. She told him how the cabin had been built, how hope had guided hands that did not yet understand hardship. They did not speak of loss directly, but it lived between them. One afternoon, while the daughters played nearby, he said, "You shouldn't be out here alone." She stiffened slightly. "We aren't alone," she said. He did not argue, but his silence held disagreement. He looked at the girls, then at her. She understood what he meant. He meant winter would return again. He meant survival was not guaranteed. He meant he was thinking beyond repairs. The realization unsettled her. She had survived by believing only in what she could control. His presence introduced variables she could not measure. Yet she found herself listening for his horse each morning. She found herself noticing when he was late. She found herself relieved when he arrived. This frightened her most of all. The daughters began inventing reasons to bring them together. They asked him to help with tasks that did not require his strength. They asked her to show him things he did not need to see. They created small, transparent excuses for proximity. They did not hide their intentions. They wanted him there. He did not resist. Neither did she. But she did not allow herself to imagine permanence. Winter eventually weakened enough to allow longer days, though snow still covered the ground. The cabin stood strong now, no longer threatening collapse. His work had saved it. One evening, as the light faded into the quiet blue of approaching night, he lingered near the doorway after finishing his tasks. The daughters had already fallen asleep inside. The world felt suspended. He stood beside her, his hat in his hands. He did not look at her immediately. "I've been thinking," he said. Her heart tightened. He was a man who spoke carefully. Words from him carried weight. He turned then, his expression steady despite the uncertainty beneath it. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. She did not answer. He continued, "I could stay." The simplicity of the statement concealed its enormity. Stay meant more than presence. Stay meant commitment. Stay meant risk. Her breath caught. She had known this moment might come, yet knowing did not make it easier. He took a small step closer. "I could be here for them, for you." The words settled heavily between them. Hope stirred, fragile and dangerous. Fear rose beside it. She thought of the grave behind the cabin. She thought of the cold nights she had survived alone. She thought of the daughters who had already given him a place in their hearts. She thought of what would happen if he left. "I can't," she said. The words felt like breaking something fragile. His expression did not change immediately, but she saw the impact in the stillness of his body. He nodded once, slowly. He did not argue. He did not ask why. He understood. He turned and walked toward his horse. The daughters slept inside, unaware of what had just been lost. She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller against the endless white. The next morning, he did not come. She told herself she expected that. She told herself it was better this way. But the daughters waited at the window anyway. They waited until the light faded. They waited until hope became confusion. She had chosen safety. Yet as night fell, the cabin felt colder than it had in weeks, and she realized with growing dread that winter had not been the only thing his presence had held back. The next morning arrived without him, and the absence felt louder than any storm had ever been. Snow still covered the ground, but it no longer looked like an enemy held at bay. It looked like something reclaiming territory. The daughters stood at the window as they always had, their small fingers pressed to the glass, their eyes searching the distant white horizon for movement that did not come. They waited long enough for hope to become uncertainty, and uncertainty to become quiet disappointment. She told herself she had done the right thing. She told herself she had protected them. But the words sounded hollow inside her own mind. The cabin held warmth, yet it felt emptier than it had before he ever arrived. The repairs he had made still held strong, but his absence exposed something she had not anticipated. Survival had once been a solitary act, something measured only in food and fire and shelter. Now survival included the shape of his voice, the weight of his presence, the quiet certainty he brought with him. Without it, the air felt thinner. The daughters asked about him in careful voices. "Is he coming today?" She forced herself to answer honestly. "I don't know." They accepted the answer, but acceptance did not lessen the loss. Days passed and still he did not come. The tracks his horse had carved into the snow faded beneath fresh snowfall until nothing remained of them at all. the land erased him with the same indifference it erased everything else. She resumed the routines she had once known so well. She gathered wood herself, her arms trembling with effort. She checked the repairs he had made, as if expecting them to fail without him. She told herself she had lived this way before and could do so again. But each task reminded her of the difference between enduring alone and being protected by someone who had chosen to stay. The daughters began to change in small ways. They spoke less about him, but they watched the horizon more often. They carried the broken wooden spoon he had fixed as if it were something sacred. One evening, as wind pressed against the walls, one of them asked quietly, "Did we do something wrong?" The question struck deeper than any accusation could have. "No," she said quickly. "Then why did he leave?" She had no answer that would not break something fragile. "He has his own life," she said finally. The words tasted like surrender. The girl looked down, absorbing this truth with the solemn resilience children learn too early. That night, long after the daughters slept, she sat alone beside the fire and listened to the cabin breathe. The repairs still held. The walls did not groan. The roof did not sag. He had given them safety that would last beyond his presence. He had given them everything except himself. She realized then that she missed him. Not his help, not his strength. Him. The admission frightened her more than winter ever had. Outside, the wind rose, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Snow began to fall again, at first gently, then with gathering intensity. She watched it through the window, unease settling into her chest. Storms were different now. Storms no longer meant only survival. They meant remembering the man who had stood between her and the cold. By morning, the storm had become a wall of white. Snow buried the land, erasing distance and direction. The daughters stayed close to her, sensing the change in the air. Then, through the swirling snow, a shape appeared. At first, she thought it was only memory made visible by longing. But the shape grew larger. A horse. A rider's. Her breath caught as recognition struck with undeniable certainty. He rode toward the cabin with grim determination, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his face hardened by cold and something deeper. The daughters saw him and cried out, their voices breaking into sudden joy. They ran for the door before she could stop them. He dismounted quickly, barely securing the reins before they reached him. They threw themselves against him, their small arms wrapping around his waist with desperate certainty. He froze for a moment, as if the contact stole his breath. Then his arms came around them. He held them tightly. She stood in the doorway, unable to move. Snow gathered on his shoulders, on their hair, on everything exposed. He looked at her over their heads. The distance between them felt enormous and fragile all at once. "I needed to make sure you were safe," he said. The words were simple, but they carried everything he had not said before. The daughters pulled back, looking up at him. "Don't leave again," one of them said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had changed. He stepped toward her slowly, the daughters still holding his hands. "I tried to stay away," he said quietly. "Why?" she asked. "Because you asked me to." The honesty of the answer broke through her defenses. He continued, "But they chose me." His gaze dropped to the daughters. "And I chose them." Then he looked at her again. "And I choose you." The storm howled around them, but inside the doorway the world felt suspended. Fear rose inside her, familiar and powerful. But so did something stronger. She saw the man who had rebuilt her home with bleeding hands. She saw the man who had returned even after being sent away. She saw the man her daughters already loved. She saw the life waiting just beyond her fear. "I was afraid," she admitted. "I know. I didn't want to lose anyone again." He stepped closer. "You won't lose me." The certainty in his voice was not a promise made lightly. It was a vow shaped by action, not words. The daughters looked between them, their eyes bright with hope they did not attempt to hide. One of them took her hand. The other took his. They pulled gently, bringing their hands together. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. Her fingers trembled as they touched his. His hand was warm despite the cold. Real. Present. She realized then that fear had protected her once. But now it was only standing between her and the life she wanted. Yes, she said. The word left her breathless. Relief flooded his expression, softening the hardness winter had carved into him. The daughters cheered, their laughter breaking the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. He stepped inside the cabin, bringing warmth with him that had nothing to do with fire. Days passed and the world began to change. Winter loosened its hold, and snow slowly gave way to earth beneath. He stayed, not as a visitor, as family. He repaired what remained broken, not because it was necessary, but because he could. He filled the cabin with presents that turned shelter into home. The daughters followed him everywhere, their trust complete and unwavering. They no longer watched the horizon with uncertainty. They watched him. One evening, as sunset painted the snow in gold, he stood outside the cabin with his hammer in hand. She joined him, standing close enough to feel his warmth. The daughters played nearby, their laughter carried by the wind. He looked at the cabin, then at her. This was never just about fixing wood, he said. She understood. It had been about fixing something inside all of them. He reached for her hand again. This time she did not hesitate. Years later, snow would fall again. But it would never feel the same. Because the cabin no longer stood alone against winter. It stood filled with love that had been built, piece by a man who had picked up a hammer and refused to walk away.